welcome to the launch of the spring edition of the International Socialism Journal. This gets released quarterly every year, and recently we've got into the habit of doing a launch for them, which I think is good in terms of sort of like getting people to sort of read the articles, but also properly engage with them as well. So, I mean, the title of this edition is Globalise the Intifadah. I think this can seem like quite an abstract title at first, but I think given the events in recent weeks and the heroic encampments by students across the world, starting in Columbia University, but sort of like rippling around the world, even to places like Iceland and Australia and so on, I think that the resistance feels sort of more international than it has done since the 7th of October. So I think it's sort of more important than ever that we're sort of discussing Palestine and continuing to discuss imperialism in the Middle East, which brings me on to our speaker, Anne Alexander, who will be here to give a lead off on her article, which is revisiting the dynamics of imperialism in the Middle East. And Anne is going to speak for around 25 minutes, and then we're also going to have time to ask questions and to discuss sort of the article. So with that, I'll hand over to Anne.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yes, I'm sorry, this is slightly underprepared, but for the good reason that I've been somewhat busy this week with supporting a student encampment in Cambridge where I work, and also involved with a whole lot of other coordination with other student encampments. I actually wanted to start there really with just to give a bit of a sense of the scale of the movement that we're seeing develop, and the way in which it's accelerated and deepened over the last few weeks is really phenomenal. And it does come back to the subject of the article. I think it comes back in very deep ways to the specific dynamics of imperialist competition at the moment. But I want to start with this kind of whiff of 1968, the whiff of the student uprising then. Which is not really hyperbole. In fact, I was on a call on Wednesday night, which was a really phenomenal testament to the scale of that movement and how far it has spread and how much organically it's connected itself with struggles by students, primarily young people, in many, many different countries, and the way that Palestine has become a symbol of the struggle for liberation for a generation of people across very large parts of the world. The call was an online one that was set up by University and College Workers for Palestine, Goldsmiths for Palestine, literally about a week to 10 days ago. And we had students from around 20 different countries on the call. There were people speaking live from encampments from the States to Australia, across Britain, people from several places in France. We had a student from Birzeit University in Palestine live on the call. And what was really phenomenal about it was the way in which all of these different movements, all of these different locations, the language was very similar, the actions that people were taking were very similar. You really felt they were part of a very deeply connected movement. They were mostly facing the same kinds of pressure and repression. They were facing attacks from their universities, their institutions, in some cases very deep examples of state repression. And what was particularly exciting about this was that the actual network that it embodied had literally come together, or not quite overnight, but almost. I mean, with propagating WhatsApp messages. We've invited 5 different student organisations in about 5 or 6 countries. 20 countries showed up on the call. Now, in some cases maybe they were just small numbers of people who happened to hear about it by accident, but in several of those cases, you're talking about people who are really live connected to, deeply embedded in actual movements on the ground that are organising. And this kind of fluorescence of activity in student organising and the energy in the movement is related to the very, very deep crisis at several levels of the global system that what's happening in Palestine represents. And it's really what I want to reflect on in terms of this, the article that I wrote, and how it connects to a broader understanding of what's going on in terms of imperialism today. When I'm talking about a crisis here at several different levels of the system, I think it's quite important to start at, if you like, at the top level of the system. And the way that I'm understanding imperialism is one that's rooted in a recognition that the dynamics of imperialist competition are replicated at several different levels of the global system. So rather than being simply a question of competition between the biggest predators in the scene, the largest states like the US, China, Russia, and so on, it's actually a means by which competition takes place, fusing economic and military forms of competition much lower down in the system as well. But if we want to start with the question of crisis, I think we do have to start at the decay at the top, if you like, the crisis that is engulfing the system from its centre. And this is why I think the movement in the States, the student movement in the States, is another sign of this. It's another sign of the deep decay, if you like, in the imperial centre in the US, which has been the kind of most powerful imperialist power for decades, that won the Cold War, that emerged from that competition between the USA and the Soviet Union as the victor in the end, became then the centre of a kind of unipolar system of imperialism, but now is actually seriously on the decline. One of the reasons why it's on the decline is actually its defeat in military defeat and political defeat in series of wars in the Middle East and in the wider Middle East. That at the very peak of its kind of imperial hubris, if you like, at the peak of the vision that the neoconservatives were pushing forward in the early 2000s of a world that was going to be dominated by US power forever, the project for a new American century, actually the US suffered in the subsequent decade a number of very serious defeats by much weaker powers, and in fact not really even by state actors in a number of cases, by the insurgency in Iraq that led to the defeat of the US over a period of several years after the US's invasion of Iraq in 2003, and also its defeat in Afghanistan, which again played itself out over many years and culminated again in a very humiliating retreat from Afghanistan a couple of years ago. That backdrop is really important, because what I was really outlining and what I want to move on to in the rest of this talk is what space that created a more middle level in the system, and how that intensifying competition between the regional powers in the Middle East is one of the things that is driving the ferocity of the Israeli assault on Gaza, and is also really opening up quite terrifying vistas of much more protracted and deeper conflict across the region. And essentially, the article that I wrote is trying to map that out in a bit of detail across a number of different axes. The kind of shifts that we see, the shifts that we've seen happening at the top level of the system, created a greater space for the powers in the middle to assert themselves. Now, I want to say something here, though, about the relationship between the big imperial powers, particularly the US, and regional powers with which it's affiliated, and which are its allies, like Israel in particular. I think that this relationship is sometimes misunderstood. There's often a way in which the relationship, for example, between the US and Israel is characterized as if the Israeli state and the Israeli ruling class are simply puppets of the United States ruling class, that there is somehow a kind of direct mechanism by which Joe Biden pulls the strings and the Israeli ruling class does what Joe Biden wants. I think there is what we've seen over the last few years is actually, I would argue, an increasing tension in that relationship. It's held together by enormous mutual interest. I'm absolutely not saying that the Israeli ruling class is about to break with the US. The Israeli ruling class is deeply committed to, and also deeply dependent on, in many ways, arms from the US, economic support from the US and so on. But the relationship has become much more infused with a lot more tension as the Israeli ruling class has, in a sense, matured as a ruling class that's in charge of an independent centre of capital accumulation in the Middle East. Even if it's a relatively small one, it's quite powerful in economic terms, and it is no longer simply dependent on subsidies from the US, even though it was at the start of the 40, 50 years ago. That was crucial to the survival of the Israeli state. That's not the case anymore. The Israeli economy has sections of it that are quite robust and dynamic, and that actually infuses this competition in the region with greater power. In a sense, what I'm arguing about the relationship between the US and and Israel is that they're now much better seen as being two instances of the same kind of thing. Two capitalist states. One is a larger one is a smaller one is the more powerful at the global level, one is deeply allied to it, but they are they're both two instances of the same type of predator. And that essentially across the region, I'm arguing as well, and this is mapped out in the article, that the behaviour of other states of a similar size, similar power in regional terms also needs to be taken into the equation when we understand the dynamics of the competition that's happening and the military conflicts that are happening in the region. So I want to talk a bit about some of Israel's allies and antagonists in the region. Of course, if you look at it from a point of view of political rhetoric, you might be forgiven for thinking that Israel is relatively isolated in the region. This is obviously a picture that's painted by the Israeli ruling class itself. Israel is this isolated citadel, one that is a lone defender of Western interests and so on. This is patently false in many, many ways, and for very many decades, the Israeli state has been buttressed by the role played by the other Arab states around about, and also with the support of states like Turkey. That's become more and more political up until 2023. That was becoming more and more politically acceptable for the rulers of a number of states, Arab states, which moved into overt forms of political alliance and diplomatic recognition of Israel. You had the so-called Abraham Accords, for example, that were brought into the fold of states that had signed treaties with Israel: Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain. It was being dangled that the Gulf states would join this list and so on. That's been temporarily somewhat disrupted by the war that Israel has unleashed on Gaza. But it's true that there are deep mutual interests between large sections of the ruling class in the Gulf and the Israeli state, formed by the fact that they are both allied with the US and have very similar kinds of relationships. One of the things that I outline in the article is some of the roles that's played by relations by India in this process. The India ruling class under Modi has forged quite tight relations with Israel and sees itself as being, part of a series of economic connections and alliances and potential trading partnerships, which also encompass the Gulf. It's very important, though, also to see that, again, the states of the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia and UAE, are also asserting themselves both militarily and diplomatically and economically to a much greater degree than in the past. Again, there's often a misconception, I think, of seeing particularly the Saudi state, the Emirati states, as going to be simply offshoots of the US. Of course, in the case of the Saudi state, was co-built with the US ruling class, or particularly with Aramco, Saudi Aramco, the oil company. But that doesn't mean that today you can think about they having completely synonymous interests or not having independent interests. In fact, we've seen that the Saudi ruling class, the the Emirati ruling class really asserting themselves militarily, not with necessarily great success, but in very aggressive ways, prosecuting the war in Yemen. Again, absolute disastrous results for the Yemeni people. Not particularly good results for the Saudi and the Emirati ruling class either, which managed to lose the war to the Houthis. Again, if you want to know why the Houthis are a player in this, in what's going on at the moment, it's because they beat the Saudis and the Emiratis in during the war that took place from 2015, and sort of it's still technically ongoing, but was in the phase of peace talks up until a few months ago. Also, you can look at the impact of Saudi and particularly Emirati intervention in Sudan. Again, the Emiratis are backing very aggressively one of the parties in the Sudanese civil war and have allied themselves very strongly with the Rapid Support Forces Committee for a long time, funding him, providing support with weapons and so on. Interestingly, the Sudanese civil war also involves the support of other regional powers who are backing different sides in the war. So, for example, Iran, which I'll come on to in a minute, is backing is quite allied with the Sudanese armed forces, so the other major protagonists. Sudanese armed forces also have the backing, to a certain extent, of Egypt. So you have different regional powers essentially participating in a struggle over Sudan. So the point that I wanted to make here is, again, you see this process whereby you have long-term economic change over decades in the Gulf, leading to a maturing of a capitalist class in that particular section of the region, which becomes, instead of just essentially sitting on top of a giant oil spigot, as Adam Hanea puts it, they become a mature capitalist class which is engaged in accumulation across a number of different sectors of the economy, including kind of petrochemicals and downstream manufacturing areas like cement, also shopping, commercial real estate, and so on. So, although despite all the distortions in the development of the Gulf economy, they are a real power. What about Iran? So, Iran, I think, is very important again to understand as another instance of this process, but from the other side of the fence in terms of its relationship with the US. Iran was the primary beneficiary of the catastrophe that engulfed the US in Iraq. And it was the catastrophe, the military catastrophe that the US faced in Iraq was also actually quite important to the Iranian ruling class's rebuilding of its regional reach and influence after the very significant defeat it suffered during at the end of the war, the long war with Iraq in the 1980s. Which again was you had dynamics of a proxy war going on there with the US supporting Iraq, supporting Saddam Hussein, in order to defeat the Islamic Republic in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, which it succeeded in doing. And for a number of years, the Islamic Republic was both isolated, very weak, and really didn't have much tangible influence outside its own borders. That changed, partly as over the decades, partly as accelerated as a result of the US invasion of Iraq and its defeat at the hands of various insurgent movements and so on in Iraq, and it's having to it lost political control of the US lost political control of Iraq to Shia Islamist parties which were allied with Iran, and Iraq formed a kind of land bridge to the rebuilding of Iranian influence in many other places, including in Syria. I'm not going to go into details about the role of Iran in the Syrian civil war, except just to emphasize that again, you had the Iranian ruling class seeking to extend its influence through both military and political and economic means, building up as well a relationship with Russia. Russia was supportive of the Bashar al-Assad's regime and worked with the Iranian regime to ensure the victory or eventual victory at enormous cost to the Syrian people, crushing of the revolutionary movement and the destruction of Syria, absolutely horrific examples that happen there in terms of massive displacement of millions of people and so on. So again, you have an example of how military, by both a number of different phases of military, economic, and political competition, feed themselves into the rebuilding of regional influence for the Iranian ruling class. Finally, I want to talk very briefly about Turkey, because I think that the Turkish state, although it's not been massively engaged in the current conflict around Palestine, is also seriously involved in regional competition, which has quite significant military dimensions. It includes, for example, a very sort of nationalist and aggressive policy that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been pushing forward, called Mavi Vatan, which means blue homeland, which is essentially a kind of theory of Turkish domination of the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the reasons why Turkey is, and many other countries are significantly very interested in the Eastern Mediterranean, is because of not only because what's on the land in that area, but also because of the oil and gas reserves that are have been parcelled out between the powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. Very large oil and gas fields have been discovered in recent years, and this is one of the factors that's driven the conflict around Gaza as well, although it's not the primary one. Turkey's also been intervening in the conflicts inside Libya as well, asserting itself and competing with, again, the UAE and other forces from the Gulf in terms of backing different factions within the Libyan conflict. So you've got a picture, I would argue, of these four powers which have really started to assert themselves militarily. Where does Israel fit into this? Because I want to bring it back to the question of what's going on in terms of the struggle for Palestinian liberation and so on. So, in the case of Israel's war on Gaza, I would say that the character of that is shaped by a whole number of different factors. One of which is this trying to assert that the Israeli ruling class is trying to assert itself in a regional, in the context of a region where it's trying to project its power and actually potentially, pull behind it reluctantly the US into confrontation with other regional powers. I think it's very clear in relation to the Iraq why the Israeli ruling class has attempted to engage with Hezbollah, has thrown drones into Syria, attacked the tried to provoke Iranian response, then eventually did provoke a response from Iran that involved quite a major drone and missile attack a few weeks ago. There are obviously also other dynamics going on that are driving what's happening in terms of the Israeli attack on Gaza, including actually the crisis inside the Israeli ruling class between two different wings of it, that although they are united in their desire to oppress the Palestinians and to maintain a version of the apartheid structures of the Israeli state, they differ about how to do it. There's a faction of them which is the religious nationalist right that are actually much more focused on the idea of expelling very large numbers of Palestinians of a kind of religious nationalist project, which is, would create a kind of ethnically and religiously pure, Jewishly pure Israeli state, which would remove large numbers of Palestinians. A really frighteningly horrific racist vision, as opposed to the kind of the other side of the Israeli establishment, which is prepared to compromise to a degree on a limited form of Palestinian self-determination, if that will be more acceptable to the US and will create greater possibilities for negotiations with, for coexistence with states like in the Gulf, to expand the number of states that would do business with Israel, and so on and so forth. They're not in favour of a two-state solution that's a meaningful one, because the forms of Palestinian self-determination that they would allow are not self-determination. I mean, they're so it's a Bantustan solution, but it's a different solution to the kinds of religious nationalist solution, which is to expel Palestinians if they can, and to, in fact, also that's one of the things that's driving the really genocidal, conduct of the war in Gaza. Is underscored by that ideological dynamic. I want to kind of just bring this back though to, if I can have, sorry, I've probably taken a little bit too long, but just in the last few minutes I want to kind of bring it back to the question of what does this mean in terms of revolutionary strategy? What does it mean in terms of perspectives for liberation from below? Because you can kind of think about the ways in which these sort of interlocking dynamics of competition between states work, and it can feel both overwhelming and despairing. One of the things that, again, I try to do in the article, and I'd be happy to discuss a bit more in the questions, is to try and link these questions to the theories that Leon Trotsky argued around permanent revolution as a way of thinking about how you can organise for revolutionary self-emancipation from below, which fundamentally means not focusing on a military strategy as the way to unlock these dynamics. It is true that if you engage in asymmetric warfare, you can often have massive successes, relatively speaking, militarily. I mean, this is really obvious. I mean, you could take the Houthis as an example. They are a very weak actor in military terms, but they have actually quite a lot of impact for their size and the amount of hardware that they have. They're very impactful what they do. Some of it is kind of geostrategic accident of where they are based, but some of it is very much related to the fact that the inability of some of the bigger powers in the region, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to defeat them in the war in Yemen. You could also look at, for example, the role of in terms of Hamas's at the beginning of this process, relative military successes compared to the size of the Israeli army, the amount of equipment that it has. Hamas clearly, in military terms, scored an enormous shock to the Israelis. It's also important to say that the Israeli military doctrine, the organising principles on which the Israeli campaign has been conducted, has been shown to be completely flawed. In terms of how Israeli military planners saw what they were trying to do in response to October the 7th, they were supposed to fight what they called a short, smart war against what they call rocket-based terror armies. So they consider Hezbollah and Hamas as armies rather than movements. Which also actually, some of this also explains, I think, part again of the absolutely horrific genocidal character of this, is because they literally do see everybody in Hamas as a competent, even if they're actually working in a hospital, or they're not in Hamas at all, they just happen to, and that short, smart war did not happen. They've been fighting a long, dumb war, which is clearly spiralling out of control. And the longer that war goes on for, and the more intense that contradiction becomes, and the more that the defeat, in their terms, becomes incredibly difficult to deal with. It does take on dimensions of the Tet Offensive against the US and the intractable problems that the US faced in the 1960s in Vietnam. But fundamentally, I don't believe that actually that kind of military asymmetric conflict is one that will bring liberation, because it can only go so far. It's limited to those kind of cracks and chinks in the imperial armoury. Where we need to break down the chains of imperialism is where they are forged, which is, it's a paraphrase of Rosa Luxemburg. She said we need to break the chains of capitalism where they're forged. Imperialism is, is a form of capitalism. It's a process that, it's a way that capitalism develops and the way that competition is driven by capitalist competition. And that means actually looking at the role of the working class, looking at the role of, in particular, the possibilities of ordinary people organising themselves in ways that fundamentally disrupt the imperialist system, which means that you actually also have to bring into the picture not only the four powers that I talked about, but also countries such as Egypt, which has a very large working class, which is playing a fundamental role, the Egyptian regime is playing a fundamental role in maintaining the siege on Gaza, that struggle and mobilisation by the Egyptian working class could, if it erupts again on the scale that it did, for example, in 2011, set light to a much wider revolutionary process. And we can see this also, again, to come back and finish on the point of the what's the relationship with the global struggles that we see. It's actually the actions of ordinary people to disrupt the war machine, where it's functioning, whether that's in a factory or whether that's in a university, whether it's in a civil service workplace, and so on, that opens up the possibilities for a very different kind of route to liberation. Finish there.
Thank you, Anna, brilliant. So now we're going to have time to move on to questions and contributions from the floor. I'm going to ask to keep your contributions to around 3 minutes. I'll let you know when you need to sum up. But yeah.
I want to ask about the Houthis actually, because you see, I'm Palestinian, and the thing is, obviously, war is not right. War is not nice. Bombing countries is not nice. It's very bad. In fact, my family lived through the Lebanese civil war when I was young. It's terrible. But the thing is with these Houthis, and because I know what these guys are like. They are so patriarchal. They treat women like second-class citizens. Awful how they treat women. Women aren't allowed to move freely. I know this mentality. I lived in the villages in Egypt. Never mind gay people. Never mind that we're anti-racist, and they literally have curses to their shoes written on their flag. And even though I don't